In the 2000 film Gladiator, Joaquin Phoenix plays Commodus, one of cinema's most memorable villains. He murders his father, Marcus Aurelius. He's consumed by jealousy and inadequacy. He's cruel, cowardly, and ultimately dies in single combat with Maximus in the Colosseum. He's a villain we love to hate, weak, pathetic, and thoroughly evil. The real Emperor Commodus was far worse. He didn't murder his father. He was the legitimate heir who inherited the throne. He didn't die in honorable combat. He was assassinated in his bath by a wrestler after a conspiracy by those closest to him. And his reign wasn't a brief descent into madness. It was 13 years of increasingly deranged behavior that makes the film version look restrained by comparison. The real Commodus thought he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the arena hundreds of times, killing animals and disabled gladiators while the audience was forced to applaud. He renamed Rome after himself. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. His paranoia led to mass executions. His incompetence and self-indulgence brought the Roman Empire to the brink of collapse. Gladiator gave us a compelling villain, but it sanitized and simplified the historical Commodus into something comprehensible. The truth is stranger, more disturbing, and reveals a level of imperial madness that even Hollywood thought was too absurd to depict. Today, we're exploring what Gladiator got wrong about Commodus, what the historical emperor was really like, and why the truth is far more horrifying than the fiction. Let's get into it. The film opens with Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, dying and planning to restore the Roman Republic by bypassing his unworthy son Commodus and naming the general Maximus as his successor. Commodus discovers this, murders his father, and seizes power. None of this happened. Marcus Aurelius was indeed a remarkable emperor, a philosopher who wrote the Meditations, one of the foundational texts of Stoic philosophy. He was also a capable military commander who spent much of his reign fighting wars along the empire's northern frontiers. The film's portrayal of him as wise and noble is reasonably accurate. But Marcus Aurelius never planned to restore the Republic. That's pure fiction. The Republic had been dead for over 2 centuries by this point. No serious Roman politician thought restoration was possible or desirable. The empire was too large, too complex, and too militarized to return to republican governance. More importantly, Marcus Aurelius fully intended for Commodus to succeed him. Commodus was born to the purple, literally born while his father was emperor, making him a legitimate heir in Roman eyes. Marcus Aurelius spent years preparing Commodus for rule, making him co-emperor in 177 AD, when Commodus was only 15 years old. For 3 years, father and son ruled together. Marcus Aurelius died of natural causes in 180 AD, likely from plague or illness, while on campaign in modern-day Austria or Slovakia. He died with Commodus by his side. There was no murder. There was no dramatic deathbed scene choosing a better successor. Commodus inherited the throne legitimately and smoothly. This raises an interesting historical question. Why did Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher who wrote extensively about virtue and wisdom, choose his obviously flawed son as successor? Couldn't he see what Commodus was becoming? The answer reveals something important about Roman imperial succession. For nearly a century before Marcus Aurelius, emperors had adopted capable men as heirs. The 5 good emperors were mostly adoptive successions. This system had worked brilliantly. But Marcus Aurelius had a biological son. Bypassing Commodus would have created a succession crisis. Other generals or senators might rally around Commodus, leading to civil war. Marcus Aurelius made what he likely thought was the pragmatic choice: ensure a smooth succession, even if the heir was imperfect. He couldn't have known just how catastrophic that decision would prove. By changing this history, Gladiator makes Commodus a usurper, which makes him a more straightforward villain. But the historical truth is more unsettling. Commodus was the legitimate emperor, chosen by one of Rome's greatest rulers, and he still managed to be catastrophic. In Gladiator, Commodus fights Maximus once, in a climactic duel where he cheats by stabbing Maximus beforehand. It's portrayed as the act of a coward seeking glory he hasn't earned. The real Commodus fought in the arena hundreds of times, And this is where history becomes stranger than any fiction. Commodus was obsessed with gladiatorial combat, not as a spectator, as a participant. He genuinely believed he was the greatest gladiator in history and the reincarnation of the hero Hercules. He commissioned statues of himself as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club. He demanded to be addressed as Hercules Romanus, the Roman Hercules. Starting around 186 AD, Commodus began appearing in the arena regularly. Ancient historians record that he fought 735 times. Let that number sink in. 735 times. This wasn't occasional imperial participation in games. This was obsessive, constant performance. But here's the thing. These weren't fair fights. Commodus fought with every advantage stacked in his favor. He fought against animals that were tied up, wounded, or otherwise incapacitated. When he fought gladiators, they were given wooden swords while he had real weapons. He fought disabled or injured opponents. The combat was staged to ensure he always won. And the audience had to applaud, enthusiastically. The Senate, the aristocracy, the common people, everyone had to cheer for Commodus's victories or risk his wrath. The historian Cassius Dio, who was a senator under Commodus and witnessed these spectacles, describes the humiliation of having to watch the emperor kill helpless animals and disabled men while shouting praise. Commodus demanded payment for these performances. He charged the state treasury 1,000,000 sesterces for each appearance, an astronomical sum. The treasury was being drained to pay the emperor to humiliate himself and the empire in the arena. He also fought as a bestiarius, a fighter who specialized in animal combat. Historical accounts describe him killing ostriches, elephants, rhinoceroses, and hippopotamuses. He once killed 100 lions in a single day. Again, these weren't dangerous hunts. The animals were brought into the arena under controlled conditions, often already wounded or weakened. The film shows Commodus as cowardly and seeking unearned glory. The historical Commodus was far stranger, a man with absolute power who chose to spend it performing in rigged spectacles, apparently genuinely believing he was demonstrating his heroic nature, while everyone who watched knew it was pathetic theater. This wasn't brief madness. This was years of behavior that violated every Roman norm about imperial dignity. Previous emperors who showed interest in the arena were criticized for unseemly behavior. Commodus made it central to his reign and his identity. The film compresses Commodus's reign into what seems like months. The historical Commodus ruled for nearly 13 years, and his behavior became progressively more erratic and dangerous. Early in his reign, Commodus was relatively conventional. He relied on capable advisors, particularly the Praetorian prefect Tygidius Perennis. But Commodus was lazy and preferred pleasure to governance. He left administration to others while he indulged in gladiatorial training and debauchery. The problem was that Commodus was also paranoid and easily manipulated. Rivals would whisper about conspiracies, and Commodus would order executions based on rumors. A real conspiracy in 182 AD, involving his sister Lucilla, failed but made his paranoia worse. Lucilla and her co-conspirators were executed. Perennis was executed in 185 AD after being accused of plotting against Commodus, likely a false charge by rivals. His replacement, Cleander, was even more corrupt. Cleander essentially sold government positions to the highest bidder. Want to be a consul? Pay Cleander. Want to be a senator? Pay more. The entire Roman government became a marketplace. This corruption caused massive resentment. In 190 AD, riots broke out in Rome. A mob marched on Commodus's palace demanding Clender's head. Commodus, terrified and spineless, immediately threw Clender to the mob. Clender was killed, and briefly Commodus tried to reform. But the pattern continued. New advisors would rise, become corrupt, or be accused of conspiracy and be executed. Commodus trusted no one and governed through fear. His paranoia led to mass purges. Senators who seemed too popular or too wealthy became targets. Accusations of conspiracy or treason were enough for execution. Property of the condemned was confiscated, which created a perverse incentive where Commodus's treasury benefited from false accusations and executions. The historian Cassius Dio, writing decades later but drawing on contemporary records, describes the atmosphere of terror. Senators lived in constant fear. Any success, any popularity, any wealth could make you a target. The empire's elite were terrorized by their own emperor. And through all of this, Commodus continued his arena performances, his spending on lavish spectacles, and his increasingly grandiose self-conception. By the early 190s, he was demanding worship as a living god, requiring people to bow before his statues and offer sacrifices to his genius. The film doesn't touch on what might be Commodus's most megalomaniacal act. In 192 AD, he renamed Rome. The Eternal City, founded centuries before, was no longer to be called Rome. It would now be Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The months of the year were renamed after his various titles. The Senate was renamed the Commodian Senate. The Roman people were to be called the Commodian people. The legions were Commodian legions. Everything was Commodus. The entire empire was to be remade in his image. This wasn't just vanity. This was a fundamental break with Roman tradition and identity. Rome's name was sacred, connected to the city's founding myths and centuries of history. Senators and common people alike were appalled. But no one could openly object. To criticize the renaming was to criticize Commodus, which meant death. So officially, everyone pretended this was wonderful. Unofficially, the hatred grew deeper. The renaming revealed how disconnected from reality Commodus had become. He genuinely seemed to believe that his greatness justified remaking the entire empire in his image. He was the new Hercules, the new founder of Rome, deserving of divine honors and total submission. Ancient sources suggest that even Commodus's closest advisors and servants found this embarrassing and concerning. But what could they do? He was the emperor, with absolute power. Criticism meant execution. So the madness continued. It's worth noting that immediately after Commodus's death, all of these changes were reversed. Rome became Rome again. The months returned to their traditional names. The Senate was just the Senate. It was as if the entire empire collectively decided to pretend the renaming had never happened. In Gladiator, Commodus dies in the arena in single combat with Maximus, stabbed in the neck after a dramatic duel. It's a fitting cinematic death for a villain. The real death was far more sordid and ignominious. By late 192 AD, Commodus had become intolerable even to those closest to him. A conspiracy formed involving his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the new Praetorian prefect Latus. These were people who had daily access to the emperor and knew his behavior intimately. The conspiracy was motivated partly by self-preservation. All three had reason to fear they might be Commodus's next victims, and partly by genuine concern for the empire. Commodus's behavior was bringing Rome to ruin. Something had to be done. On December 31st, 192 AD, the conspirators acted. First, they tried poison. Marcia added it to Commodus's wine during his usual evening debauchery. Commodus drank it, but then vomited, either because he'd drunk too much or because his body rejected the poison. The conspirators panicked. If Commodus survived and discovered the poison, they would all be tortured and executed. They needed to finish the job immediately. They sent in Narcissus, an athlete and wrestling partner who Commodus trained with regularly. While Commodus was weakened from the poison and vomiting, Narcissus strangled him in his bath. The Emperor of Rome, who fancied himself Hercules reborn, the greatest gladiator in history, was murdered naked in his bathtub by a wrestler. There was no dramatic arena duel, no noble combat, just a poisoning that failed followed by strangulation in a bathtub. It was inglorious, pathetic, and somehow fitting for an emperor whose entire reign had been a grotesque performance. The Senate, when informed of Commodus's death, erupted in joy. Cassius Dio describes senators shouting insults at the dead emperor's memory, something that would have been suicidal hours before. They declared damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Statues of Commodus were torn down. His name was chiseled off monuments. The renaming of Rome was immediately reversed. The conspiracy chose the general Pertinax as the new emperor. Pertinax was a capable, respected military commander. Exactly the kind of serious person Rome needed after Commodus's madness. But Pertinax would last only 3 months before being assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, kicking off the chaotic Year of the Five Emperors in 193 AD. Commodus's death didn't immediately fix Rome's problems. His reign had been so destructive, had created such instability and corruption that recovery would take years. But at least the madness was over. So why did Gladiator change so much about Commodus? Why make him a usurper instead of a legitimate heir? Why show one rigged duel instead of hundreds? Why have him die in combat instead of strangled in a bath? The answer is dramatic structure and audience expectations. First, the film needed a clear villain whose villainy was unambiguous. Making Commodus murder his father establishes him as evil from the start. Making him a usurper means his rule is illegitimate, which justifies rebellion against him. These changes simplify the moral landscape. The historical truth that Marcus Aurelius chose Commodus as heir is more complicated and less cinematically satisfying. It raises uncomfortable questions about Marcus Aurelius's judgment and about the inherent problems with hereditary succession. Those questions don't fit into a 2-hour action film. Second, showing hundreds of rigged gladiatorial combats would make Commodus seem pathetic and absurd rather than threatening. The film needs Commodus to be a credible antagonist. Showing him repeatedly fighting disabled opponents while forcing the Senate to applaud would undermine his menace. One dramatic duel with Maximus is more cinematic. Third, Commodus dying in a bathtub isn't visually compelling. Cinema demands a dramatic climax. Having Commodus and Maximus duel in the Colosseum provides that climax. It brings the film's themes together, the gladiator and the emperor, the slave and the master, meeting in the arena. The screenwriters made defensible choices given the medium, but the result is a Commodus who's more conventionally villainous than the historical emperor. Film Commodus is cruel and power-hungry, but comprehensible. Historical Commodus was genuinely deranged in ways that strain believability. This is a recurring problem with historical films. The truth is often stranger than fiction, but if you depict it accurately, audiences might think you're exaggerating for effect. To be fair to Gladiator, let's acknowledge what it got right about Commodus and his era. The corruption. The film shows a corrupt, decaying Rome, and this is accurate for the later years of Commodus's reign. The selling of offices, the paranoia, the atmosphere of fear. These were real. Commodus's narcissism, Joaquin Phoenix's performance captures Commodus's neediness, his desperate desire for approval and glory. The historical Commodus was indeed deeply insecure despite his absolute power. His interest in the arena. While the film drastically undersells this, it at least acknowledges that Commodus was inappropriately obsessed with gladiatorial combat. The emperor who fought in the arena is historically attested. The opposition to him. The film shows that many Romans despised Commodus, which is accurate. Senators, generals, and even people close to him recognized he was destroying the empire. The conspiracy. While the film invents the details, there was indeed a conspiracy that killed Commodus involving people from his inner circle. Marcus Aurelius as contrast. The film's depiction of Marcus Aurelius as wise and thoughtful, in stark contrast to his son, reflects the historical reality. The philosopher-emperor followed by the arena-obsessed narcissist is a real and remarkable historical irony. The general context. The film correctly places us in the period when the Pax Romana was ending and Rome was entering a more troubled era. Commodus's reign did mark a turning point toward instability. So Gladiator isn't completely divorced from history. It captures certain truths about the period and about Commodus's character. But it simplifies, sanitizes, and restructures events to fit dramatic needs. The historical Commodus offers lessons that the film version doesn't. First, about the dangers of absolute power. Commodus had literally no check on his authority. He could kill anyone, rename anything, demand any honors, and no one could stop him. This absolute power enabled his worst impulses. The historical Commodus is a case study in how unchecked authority corrupts and enables madness. Second, about the problems with hereditary succession. Marcus Aurelius was one of history's great rulers. His son was catastrophic. This isn't unusual in hereditary systems. Competence doesn't pass genetically. Rome's greatest period of stability came when emperors adopted capable heirs. The return to hereditary succession with Commodus showed the system's fundamental flaw. Third, about the fragility of institutions. The Roman Senate, the administrative apparatus, the traditions of governance, all of it proved helpless against one determined mad emperor. Institutions depend on people respecting them. When someone with absolute power stops caring about norms and traditions, they can unravel surprisingly quickly. Fourth, about performance and propaganda. Commodus's arena spectacles were propaganda, demonstrations of his heroic nature. That the propaganda was transparently false didn't stop him from continuing. There's something contemporary about a leader more interested in performance than governance. Finally, about how tyranny ends. Commodus wasn't defeated in glorious revolution, he was killed by his own servants in an inglorious assassination. Tyranny often ends not with dramatic confrontation, but with betrayal from within, when even loyalists can no longer tolerate the tyrant. These are serious historical lessons obscured by Gladiator's heroic narrative. Gladiator gave us a compelling villain in Commodus, jealous, cruel, and ultimately defeated in combat by the hero. It's effective cinema that works dramatically. But the historical Commodus was far stranger and more disturbing than the film depicts. He didn't murder his father, he was the legitimate heir of a great emperor. He didn't fight once in the arena, he fought hundreds of times in rigged spectacles. He didn't die in glorious combat, he was poisoned and strangled in his bath. And his reign wasn't a brief period of villainy. It was 13 years of escalating madness that brought Rome to the brink. The truth about Commodus is more unsettling than fiction, because it shows how destructive one person with absolute power can be, how fragile even great empires are when leadership fails, and how the descent from competence to catastrophe can happen within a single generation. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, was followed by Commodus, the arena-obsessed narcissist who renamed Rome after himself and demanded to be worshipped as Hercules. That's not a Hollywood invention, that's historical reality, and it's more disturbing than any fictional villain. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what Gladiator got wrong about Commodus, let me know in the comments what other historical films you'd like me to analyze. And if the real story surprised you, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.